Romans 8:28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. So the first words of this verse, and we know. Chapter 8, verse 22 says, for we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. So we know, according to God's word, this is happening and has been happening and will be happening until Jesus' return. Chapter 8, verse 26 says, for we do not know what to pray as we ought. If you remember, as we looked at that verse, we talked about occasions and circumstances where we don't know what to pray. We don't know how to pray. We don't know what words to pray. There are things we don't know. And in Romans 8:28, we find something else that we do know, that we can bank everything on. For those who love God. So we're talking about the same group of people he's been speaking to the whole time in the book of Romans. The church, Christians, those who have placed faith alone in Jesus for the forgiveness of their sins. One of the characteristics of Christians is that we love God. Matthew 22, verse 37, Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? And he responds, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. Christians love God. So Paul says, and we know that for those who love God, but he also refers to us another way at the end of this verse, for those who are called according to his purpose. Romans chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. Paul speaking to the church, he says, including you who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. We belong to Jesus because he called us to himself. In Romans chapter 1, verse 7, it says, to all those in Rome who are loved by God and called to be saints. So we are saints because God has called us to himself. So not only do we love God, but we were called by God. We could put it like John does in 1 John chapter 4, verse 19. He says, we love because he first loved us. So we love him because he called us. And Paul refers to us in both ways, those who love God and those who were called by God according to his purpose. Take this in for a moment. This verse is telling us we know something for sure in every circumstance. We know this to be true, that for the Christian, all things work together for good. Find examples of this all over God's word. In the book of Genesis, we see Joseph go through terrible circumstances. And it all began with the abuse of his brothers. Had they not done that, the other circumstances wouldn't have followed. He's eventually reunited with his brothers, and they're very fearful of what his response to them might be. And Joseph said to them, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. We can go through the Old Testament, New Testament, and see that truth echoed over and over again. But it's nowhere echoed louder than the cross. In Acts 2:23, Jesus is preaching and he comes to the point where he talks about the crucifixion of Jesus, and he says this Jesus delivered up, so he's talking about his arrest and crucifixion, this Jesus delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. So what men meant for evil, to kill and destroy Jesus, God meant for good, not just for Jesus, but all those who would place faith in him. This is a massive truth. And it trickles down into every day and every circumstance of our lives. Mundane days that seem to not matter, frustrating circumstances, even our own blunders, our own sin, even when we are harmed or hurt by the sin of others, sickness, disease, suffering, tragedy, death, evil intentions. The list goes on and on and on. From the things that seem to matter the least to the things that seem the most devastating. We know that for those who love God, every one of these things work together for good. And we need to ask two important questions as we continue to reflect on this verse. One is this: who does this work? Who uses it for good? The answer is obvious in this verse, but it becomes much more obvious in the verses ahead, as we'll see as we continue to study Romans 8. But it's God. God is the one who takes every single one of these circumstances. He uses it for the good of his people. Brings up a second question. Does that make all of these things good? Does that make Joseph's brothers' intentions to kill him good? Does it make the people who framed and had Jesus unjustly arrested and crucified, does it make those intentions and that sin against the Holy Son of God good? Does it make the things in our lives where we've been harmed by others, or our sickness or disease good? And the answer to all those things is an adamant no. Those things are still bad, some of them awful and terrible. But that's what makes this truth that we know so good, is that God in his sovereignty can take even the worst things and use it for the good of his people, those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Now, the final thing we need to say about this is you've probably heard people say, well, everything happens for a reason. And most of the time that's applied to anyone and everyone. And it's kind of a sentiment that, like, it'll all work out. I'll be better for it. Somehow this suffering is good for me. This trial is good for me. And what this verse says is that all things work together for good for those who love God, for those who are called according to his purpose. Not everyone, just God's people. So this is an exclusive truth that we know, and it's a good truth that we know. And even if we don't see how, or we can't imagine how, the most mundane day or the most awful day will be used by our God for our good. Romans 8:28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose.